He lost his wife and son in one tragic night and thought his life was over. But when he stopped to save a dying stray dog, the animal led him to a secret his wife had hidden all along, a truth buried so deep it would turn his grief into an unexpected fortune. James Hudson woke up every morning to the same silence. The house was quiet, heavy, and empty. There was no laughter from his little boy, no sound of footsteps running down the stairs, no soft voice calling him to breakfast. 8 months had passed since the night everything ended. It had been raining hard, the road was slick, and their car had gone off the highway. His wife and son died instantly. He survived. Every day after that felt like punishment. He still went to work, though nothing there mattered anymore. He was a construction manager, just doing his job, following routines because they gave shape to the long days. At the office, he nodded when people spoke to him, though he rarely listened. In the evenings, he sat by the window with a cup of cold coffee, watching the lights of passing cars disappear into the dark. The house around him looked perfect, clean, organized, and dead. He stopped cooking real meals. Most nights he ate cereal or takeout, sitting at the kitchen counter with the TV playing quietly in the background. He hadn't touched his wife's side of the bed or their son's toys in the corner of the living room. Sometimes he thought about packing them away, but the idea made him feel sick. The silence had become a strange kind of company. Late one November evening, after another long day, James drove home along the highway. The air was cold and the sky had no stars. Headlights stretched out in a narrow line ahead of him. Then he noticed a dark shape on the side of the road. At first he thought it was trash, but as he got closer, it moved slightly. He slowed down and stopped on the shoulder. It was a dog, old, thin, with patches of fur missing and a bleeding paw. The animal looked too weak to stand. James stood there for a few seconds, unsure why he had even stopped. He hadn't cared about much in months, but something made him kneel down and lift the dog into the back seat. He drove to the nearest veterinary clinic that was still open. The vet told him the dog was dehydrated, exhausted, and hurt, not young anymore, maybe too old to fight for life. James left his number, paid for the treatment, and went home, expecting not to hear back. The next day the clinic called. Against all odds, the dog had survived. James picked him up and brought him home. He placed a blanket near the sofa, filled a bowl with water, and watched as the dog curled up without hesitation, as if he had always belonged there. For the first time in months, there was another heartbeat in the house besides his own. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of the grave, just the quiet sound of life slowly returning. James named the dog Harry. Every morning Harry waited by the door, and every evening he was there again when James came home. It became their routine. James started going outside more often. He took Harry for walks along the same trails he used to walk with his son. They passed the lake where he and his family used to feed ducks. The air there always felt different, cold but alive. For the first time in months, James noticed small things again. The sound of wind, the way the leaves moved, the smell of water. At home, Harry stayed close to him. When the house got dark in the evenings, the dog would lie near his feet, quiet and still. The silence that once filled every corner of the house started to change. It wasn't gone, but it no longer felt so heavy. There was now breathing, movement, and the soft sound of paws on the floor. James caught himself talking to the dog. Not real conversations, just small comments. He said what he was thinking, about the weather, about dinner, about needing to buy more food for Harry. The dog watched him carefully, as if he understood every word. That calm presence helped James stay grounded. He didn't feel completely alone anymore. Weeks passed, and life started to find some kind of rhythm. James still went to work, but he no longer stayed late just to avoid going home. He cooked simple meals, cleaned a little, and even played old music sometimes while Harry slept nearby. The house finally sounded different. There was movement, sound, and warmth where before there had been only emptiness. One night when the house was quiet, Harry suddenly stood up. His ears twitched, and he began scratching at the door that led to the basement. James told him to stop, but the dog wouldn't listen. The scratching continued for several minutes until James finally pulled him away. The next night, the same thing happened again. Frustrated, James decided to check what was bothering him. He took a flashlight and went down the narrow stairs. The basement was clean and organized, just like he always kept it. There were boxes stacked neatly on one side and tools hanging on the wall. Everything seemed normal, but Harry walked straight to the far corner and started sniffing near the old shelf that stood against the concrete wall. James watched as the dog pushed his nose between the boxes, focused on one particular spot in the wall. It was strange. The concrete there looked smooth and newer than the rest. Harry wouldn't move away from it, just kept pressing his nose against the same place, whining softly. James frowned. He couldn't understand what the dog had found or why he was acting like that. After a while, he told him to come upstairs. Harry hesitated but followed. Still, as James turned off the light and closed the basement door, he couldn't stop thinking about that small patch of wall and the dog's strange insistence. Something about it felt out of place, though he didn't know why yet. The next morning, James went down to the basement again. He moved the boxes off the shelf and looked closely at the wall where Harry had been sniffing. One section of the concrete looked different from the rest. It was smoother and a slightly lighter color, as if someone had repaired it not long ago. He touched the surface and felt that it was newer than the surrounding wall. He brought a small hammer from his tool bag and tapped gently. The sound was hollow. He hit harder and a thin layer of plaster began to fall away. Behind it was something metallic. James cleared the dust with his hand and stepped back. It wasn't just a patch. It was a small door made of steel with a digital lock. He stared at it for a while, trying to remember if his wife, Lauren, had ever mentioned anything about a hidden room or storage space. She hadn't. He felt confused. They had lived in this house for years, and he thought he knew every inch of it. Yet here was a door he had never seen before. James tried a few random combinations on the keypad, but nothing worked. Then he searched through the nearby drawers and boxes for any clue. Most of the papers were old manuals, receipts, and warranty cards. But in one envelope, he found a folded note written in Lauren's handwriting. It was a short list of numbers, 6 digits written carefully in blue ink. He hesitated, then entered the numbers into the lock. There was a soft click. The door opened slowly, and a narrow light flickered on inside. The space beyond was small, like a walk-in closet, but everything inside was neatly arranged. It looked more like an office or a vault than a secret room. Along one wall stood shelves filled with labeled boxes. Each box contained folders, certificates, and thick stacks of documents. A metal desk stood in the corner with a laptop and a small safe on top of it. James opened one of the boxes and saw official-looking papers, property deeds, contracts, and shares in several companies. He didn't recognize most of the names. On the desk, next to the laptop, was another envelope addressed to him in her handwriting. Inside were several letters. He sat on a small stool and began to read them one by one. The handwriting was familiar, calm, and precise. In the letters, Lauren explained the truth he had never known. Her family had owned a large international investment company. She had hidden it from him, afraid that money and status would change their relationship. She wanted a normal life, a quiet family, and real love. She wrote that a year before her death, she had transferred all her assets, properties, accounts, and shares into his name. Everything had been done legally and kept secret until the right time. The letters mentioned a safety deposit box at the bank downtown. Inside it, there were official documents and the full instructions for managing her estate. She had even left the small metal key to that box taped to one of the letters. James sat in silence for a long time. The clock on the basement wall ticked slowly, and the faint sound of Harry moving upstairs reminded him that the world outside was still there. He looked around the room again, realizing how carefully she had planned everything. Every file, every number, every letter was in order. He didn't feel excitement or greed. He mostly felt shock and confusion. He had lived next to this secret for years without knowing it. The woman he thought he knew completely had carried a whole other life, quiet, hidden, but incredibly vast. As he turned off the light and closed the metal door, he understood that his life was about to change again, in a way he could not yet imagine. The next morning, James drove to the bank with the metal key and the documents he had found in the hidden room. He didn't really believe any of it was true. It all felt like a strange dream or a mistake that someone would soon correct. But when he arrived, the staff at the private banking department recognized the name on the documents. They took him to a quiet office and asked him to wait. After some time, a manager entered with several folders. The woman spoke politely, explaining that his late wife, Lauren Hudson, had established several trusts and investment accounts under her maiden name and transferred them to his name more than a year ago. Everything had been verified and approved. She showed him the documents. His signature appeared on one of them, dated from the time when Lauren had asked him to sign what he thought was a mortgage renewal. He had signed without reading. When she told him the total value of the assets, he couldn't speak. The number was unreal, more than $1 billion in stocks, real estate, and offshore investments. He sat in silence, trying to understand how the woman he had lived with for years had kept something like this from him. The manager handed him a list of accounts and passwords and asked if he wanted financial advisors assigned to help manage everything. James only nodded. His mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing Lauren's handwriting on those letters from the night before. She had written that she wanted to protect him, that she wanted their life to stay simple. He now understood what that meant. While he worked regular hours and worried about bills, she had spent nights reviewing financial reports, sending encrypted messages to lawyers, and planning long-term strategies for a fortune she never used for herself. Driving home, he tried to remember signs he had missed. She had sometimes stayed up late in her home office, saying she needed to finish some charity reports. She had gone on short trips to New York and Chicago for family business. He had believed it all without question. She hadn't lied directly. She had simply chosen not to share that part of her life. James stopped at a red light and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't look like a rich man. He looked tired and older than 30. The money didn't change anything. It didn't bring back his wife or their son. It didn't fix the silence at home or the ache that stayed inside him every morning when he woke up alone. When he got home, the house looked the same, clean, quiet, and cold. He placed the folders on the kitchen table and sat down. The numbers on the pages meant nothing to him. They were just ink, just paper. Lauren had hidden the truth to protect him, but now that truth felt like another loss. He had lived beside her for years and still hadn't truly known her. He looked around the living room. The photographs, the furniture, the soft traces of her presence were still there, but they no longer brought comfort. Instead, they reminded him of how much he hadn't seen. He felt both grateful and ashamed, grateful for her love, ashamed for being blind to who she really was. James sat for a long time without moving. Outside, cars passed by and the day continued like any other. The world didn't care that he was suddenly a billionaire. Inside, nothing had changed. The chair across from him was still empty. The sound of laughter would never return. All the money in the world couldn't fill that silence. Several months passed. James quit his job at the construction company. He no longer needed the income, and the work had stopped giving him any sense of purpose. For a while, he stayed home, unsure what to do with all the money that now belonged to him. Every day felt the same, but at least he wasn't drowning in sadness anymore. The pain was still there, just quieter, like an old scar. One morning, while walking Harry through the industrial part of town, James noticed an old brick building with broken windows and a faded sign. It had once been a warehouse. A stray cat ran across the yard, and he saw two thin dogs searching for food near the dumpster. He stood there for a long time, thinking about them. Later that week, he called a contractor, bought the property, and began repairs. Within a few months, the place looked different. The walls were cleaned, new fences were built, and the floors were reinforced. He turned the main room into a shelter for stray animals. There were beds, blankets, and a small medical area where a local vet volunteered a few times a week. James paid for everything himself but didn't tell anyone who he really was. Harry became the heart of the shelter. People who visited always noticed him first, an old dog with gray fur and calm eyes who followed James everywhere. They called him the Guardian. He moved slowly now, but he was always watching, as if making sure every new animal felt safe. James worked quietly every day. He helped clean cages, brought food, and talked to volunteers. Sometimes he drove to the edge of town to pick up abandoned dogs or cats. He didn't see it as charity. It was simply what he felt right doing. The shelter gave him structure and reason to wake up in the morning. At night, when the work was done and the lights were dimmed, James sat on a wooden bench outside. The air smelled of grass and rain. From the open windows, he could hear the sounds of the animals settling down, quiet steps, soft breathing, the shuffle of paws against the floor. He always looked at Harry, lying beside him, and felt a strange peace. He often thought about how his life had changed. The money no longer seemed important. It was just a tool that allowed him to build something good, something that mattered. He realized that real wealth wasn't about the size of an account or the number of houses someone owned. It was about being able to help, to make things a little better, even for those who had no voice. Sometimes, when new volunteers arrived, they asked how he had started all this. James just said he once found a dog on the side of the road and decided to give him a home. That was the truth, though not the whole story. As the months went by, more animals were rescued, and more people came to help. The shelter became known around the city as a place where every living creature was treated with care. James didn't look for praise or attention. He only wanted to create something meaningful, something his wife would have been proud of. Every evening ended the same way. James sat on that same bench, watching the lights of the city in the distance. Harry lay beside him, eyes half closed, breathing softly. Around them, life went on, simple, quiet, and real. James finally felt that he was where he needed to be. It was spring when James went back to the basement. Months had passed since he first found the hidden room. The space no longer felt cold or secret. It had turned into a small archive for the foundation he had built in Lauren's name. Files, folders, and donation records were stacked neatly on the shelves. On the desk stood a framed photo of Lauren holding their son, both smiling. The picture had faded slightly, but it still felt alive to him. It reminded him of the reason he had kept going. Harry lay beside his chair, older now, gray around the muzzle, breathing slowly and evenly. The dog didn't move as quickly anymore, but he still followed James everywhere. When James worked too long, Harry would rest his head on his foot as if to remind him it was time to step outside. That afternoon, Harry did exactly that. He got up, nudged James's leg, and walked toward the door. James sighed, put away his pen, and followed. They went out of the house and down the quiet street toward the park nearby. The sky was clear, and the air smelled of fresh grass. Harry led the way, walking slower than before but with purpose. They passed the lake, where families were feeding ducks, and stopped near a small path lined with blooming trees. There, on a bench, sat a young woman with a small puppy in her arms. The puppy barked softly when it saw Harry, and the old dog wagged his tail for the first time in weeks. The woman looked up, smiled, and greeted him. Her face caught James completely off guard. She wasn't identical to Lauren, but there was something in her expression, a kindness, a calmness that felt so familiar it stopped him in place. Her smile was gentle, open, and warm, the same way Lauren's had been when they first met years ago. They talked for a while, simple things about dogs and the park. Her name was Emily, and she had recently adopted the puppy from a local shelter. James felt something stir inside him, something quiet, not like the sharp pain he had carried for so long. It was softer, lighter. He hadn't felt anything like it since before the accident. When they said goodbye, she waved, and he noticed Harry still looking at her and the puppy, tail slowly moving. It almost seemed like the dog had planned the whole meeting. On the way home, James felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, the world didn't seem so empty. There was a sense that something new might be beginning. Later that evening, James went back to the basement. He sat at the desk and looked again at the photo of Lauren and their son. The light from the small window touched the frame, and for a moment, he thought the smile in the picture looked brighter. He knew he would never forget her, but he also knew she wouldn't have wanted him to live in the past forever. Harry lay near his feet again, tired but content. The air through the open window carried the sounds of spring, birds, laughter from outside, and the quiet hum of life. The silence in the house was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, filled with new meaning. James looked around and realized that Lauren had left him more than wealth. She had left him the strength to start over, the courage to let life in again. And maybe, just maybe, she had sent Harry to guide him not only to the truth she once hid, but also to someone who could help him feel alive again. Thank you for watching. Your likes and comments truly inspire me to keep creating original, meaningful stories for you. Every video on this channel is 100% new and crafted with care. Real, emotional narratives you won't find anywhere else. I put my heart and time into every story to make each one special. Thank you for subscribing. See you in the next video.